Blade is a character that almost anyone interested in comic book movies or action films would easily identify. The character is the epitome of cool, with his katana, martial arts prowess, and long trenchcoat look making him an iconic black action movie hero. The character made an impact when his film Blade was first released in 1998 and became an instant classic. However, what most people do not know is that the character has a vast and long history in the pages of Marvel Comics before he ever appeared on the big screen. Let me take you on a journey as we see the humble origins of the character known as Blade and how he came to be as we know him today. How did Blade first get his origin story in comics? Blade, though now a prominent member of the Marvel Comics universe, started out rather humbly in the pages of Marvel's horror comic book, The Tomb of Dracula No. 10, in 1973. In fact, according to one of his creators, Marv Wolfman, he almost would have wound up appearing in a non-Marvel comic named Eerie, published by Warren Publishing. Warren Publishing itself would become famous for its magazine Vampirella, another character now known as a vampire comic book icon. Unlike standard superhero comics, The Tomb of Dracula was a Marvel horror series built around Dracula and the hunters trying to stop him. The actual good guys were often reduced to supporting characters and victims, but Blade was introduced as a contrast to the other characters in the story, as someone who has the ability to go toe-to-toe with one of these supernatural creatures. As was the custom at the time, the Blade we saw in the pages of The Tomb of Dracula was introduced into the story as a fully fleshed out character, with the story focusing more on his actions than on his backstory and origin. He was also vastly different from how we see Blade today, with a stylish afro and wooden blades as his arsenal, as opposed to the katana or guns which we associate with the character now. But perhaps the most striking difference from Blade today is that this initial version of Blade was not portrayed like the modern superpowered Daywalker. Instead, he was mainly shown as a human vampire hunter whose defining supernatural advantage was his immunity to vampire bites, which prevented him from being turned into a vampire. Thus, instead of being a terrifying daywalker who vampires are deathly afraid of, he's a skilled hunter using his intelligence and martial prowess to overcome vampires who are far more powerful than himself. Indeed, despite this early incarnation possessing none of the full Daywalker powers current-day Blade has, in his first appearance alone, he is shown fighting and eventually besting Dracula himself in his own title, no less. Blade's origins are revealed very early in The Tomb of Dracula No. 13, where he reveals why he is immune to vampire bites. His mother, Tara Brooks, while pregnant with him, was struggling with the pregnancy when she started to undergo labor. Rather than risking sending her away, the women around her decided to call for a doctor instead. However, the person who arrived was not a doctor, but a vampire named Deacon Frost, who took the opportunity to prey on the helpless Tara and drain her of her blood. Though this act killed her, the vampiric enzymes that entered her bloodstream made their way to her child, Blade, which gave him his immunity to being turned into a vampire. The vampire was driven away by the other women there, which ultimately saved the life of the baby, Eric Brooks, who would later be known as Blade. Thus, a young Eric was, from birth, given a reason to hate vampires, with all his struggles originating from this one event. The event defined him, motivating him to learn how to take on his vampiric foe. Now, as an adult, he finds himself fighting the creatures of the night and saving the lives of those they target. Thus begins the story of Blade, the vampire hunter, as we know and love him. The origin is simple but elegant in how concise it is. Everything about Blade that makes him who he is can be found within this origin. It is thus no shock that future comics and adaptations decided to keep returning this origin story, even when they retooled his exact powers and physiology. Blade's appearance as one of the first major black characters within the Marvel Comics universe is also no accident. Marv Wolfman described his decision to make Blade an African-American character as a result of his struggles at DC and Marvel trying to pitch a black superhero character who wouldn't seem like a stereotype or a caricature. Blade was also influenced by blaxploitation films that were popular at the time. African-American centered films that dealt with black themes and struggles in a pulpy action movie way. This genre of action films has left a visible influence on the style and design of Bliss, a character, with his afro and exaggeratedly stylish clothes, including his green jacket and yellow goggle. It also had an influence on his dialogue, with Marv Wolfman wanting to do something different from the stereotypical way black people in Marvel Comics were written to sound. Though Blade was established as being born and brought up in London, his dialogue is written as a clear pastiche of blaxploitation films. It also influenced Blade's early identity as a mostly human hunter rather than a full superhero powerhouse. Blade, more than his powers, is noted for his single-minded determination in combating vampires and his skill and strategic thinking that consistently allow him to gain the upper hand. How did the comics expand Blade's backstory in the 1970s? Though Blade was one of the breakout stars of the Tomb of Dracula comics, he was still just a supporting character in a title revolving around Dracula himself. In these kinds of comic books, the villains are often more interesting and given more prominence in the narrative than the actual good guys, who we are supposed to root for. However, all this changed once Marv Wolfman got an opportunity to flesh out the character in the pages of Vampire Tale, another horror anthology comic that Marvel was publishing at the time. During this era, Marvel was publishing comics other than simple superhero fare, with horror anthologies like Tomb of Dracula and Vampire Tales, as well as fantasy comics like Barry Windsor Smith's adaptation of Conan the Barbarian stories. And me personally, I wish we could have such a variety of stories being published by Marvel today as well. Wolfman, along with fellow writer Chris Claremont, who would go on to be the definitive writer on Uncanny X-Men, fleshed out the story of the human vampire hunter as well as his life between his birth and his introduction in the pages of Tomb of Dracula. We're introduced to a dingy neighborhood in London filled with poverty and misery, where we see that one of the people living here, a prostitute, finds the corpse of her lover as vampire bats flee the scene. It turns out that the prostitute works out of the very same brothel that Blade's mother, Tara, had been working, and where she was ultimately killed by the vampire. The vampire's identity is later established as Deacon Frost, the elderly white-haired vampire whom Blade pledges to find and destroy. Lady Vanity, the madame of the establishment, helped birth young baby Eric and raised him along with the other women working in the brothel. It is fitting that a character as unusual as Blade has an upbringing that's equally unusual, but as the interactions between Blade and the women there show, he never lacked the love of a family. Thus, it is a tragedy that, as a consequence of Blade's attack and escape from a vampiric coven, we see the coven attack Lady Vanity's establishment, resulting in her death and the deaths of almost every other woman working, despite Blade's best attempts to stop it. We also learn of Jamal Afari, a jazz trumpeter who moonlighted as a vampire hunter and slew them with silver. When young Eric Brooks saw him getting attacked by young goons, Eric, though 9 years of age, still tried to help without hesitation. However, they were no ordinary boys, but vampires, and Eric watched in awe as the old man took up his silver weapon and fought off the vampires on his own. It was under his tutelage that we see young Eric Brooks turn into Blade, the vampire hunter. However, tragedy would strike as one day Blade returned to find his old mentor turned into one of the creatures he spent his life hunting. Driven insane by the transformation and thirst for human blood, Jamal attacked him, while revealing that he was turned by none other than Dracula himself. Blade was thus forced to kill him in self-defense, an act that haunts him this day, with him dedicating his life to getting back at Dracula as revenge for his mentor, Jamal. Though important to Blade's backstory, this would never be adapted in the animated series or films, instead being replaced by the white Abraham Whistler. Thus, by the end of his solo run on Vampire Tales, Blade is at his lowest, with almost none of the people of his past remaining. As such, he turns to an old ally, Quincy Harker, one of his allies from the pages of Tomb of Dracula, who helps him to confront the mysterious leader of the Legion of the Damned, the vampiric coven that caused the deaths of his loved one. Blade's struggles against the coven lead him into a conspiracy involving a serum that would give vampires the ability to walk in daylight, eliminating one of their biggest weaknesses and allowing them to take over the world. He also finds himself in a moral dilemma after he causes the death of an innocent 12-year-old girl during one of his fights with the Legion. Though he is determined to give himself up and answer for his crime, Blade still fights to prevent the Legion from following through with their plan, successfully destroying the serum and its formula, as well as taking down the Legion itself. It is then that he discovers the true master behind the Legion of the Damned, none other than his fated enemy, Count Dracula himself. Wolfman and Claremont also explore a bit of his past as well, specifically his activities in China during 1968. Blade hunted a vampire called Kuai He, servant of Dracula, alongside other black human vampire hunters named Ogun, Azu, Musenda, and Orji. Together, they lay a trap for and succeed in staking Dracula through the heart, though Kuai He manages to help Dracula escape from the trap and survive. Dracula, in vengeance, killed off all hunters who were present during that attack, save for Blade and Musenda. It is from these black vampire hunters that Blade learns of the efficiency of the wooden knives they use, identical in function to the stakes they use to drive into a vampire's heart to destroy them. These stories, set in the past and present of Blade's career, are important in showcasing Blade as a character who can lead a solo comic book. From the rather limited origin story we saw back in Tomb of Dracula number 13, we get a much more fleshed out and detailed story of Blade's origins, showing us, the audience, his childhood and his tutelage under Jamal Afari, learning the basics of vampire hunting and becoming the character we know today. From a supporting character in a book about Dracula, Blade himself became the leading man with a supporting cast around him.
Who are you? What do you want with me? Call me Blade.
When did Blade first appear in animation, and how was his origin retooled? Considering Blade's very dark and horrifying origin story, as well as his origins as a horror comic character, it is surprising that his first major screen adaptation was not a standalone horror action film, but rather Spider-Man the Animated Series from the 90s. His origins are explored in the episodes Blade the Vampire Hunter and The Immortal Vampire, both airing in 1995. Being a child-friendly series, Blade's origin story was also tweaked. Instead of a pregnant woman being attacked in a brothel by a vampire, Blade's mother, here called Miriam, is revealed to have had a love affair with the vampire known as Deacon Frost. However, Frost eventually abandoned Miriam and left her to raise Blade alone. However, she herself would eventually give him up for adoption, leading him to be taken to an orphanage. However, Blade would run away from the orphanage as a teen, living off the street and through petty robbery. Around this time, Blade would discover his abilities as a half-vampire, giving him the abilities of vampires with none of the weaknesses. It is at this period in time that Abraham Whistler, a famous vampire hunter, finds him and takes him in. Whistler taught Blade everything he knew about hunting vampires and trained him to take advantage of his half-vampire heritage to effectively fight vampires. Whistler was introduced outside the original comics, first becoming part of Blade's screen mythology through Spider-Man the Animated Series before the 1998 movie made him iconic. His role in the original comics was done by Jamal Afari. However, it is Whistler who is embedded in popular culture as the mentor of Blade, in no small part due to the live-action 1998 film. Blade meets Spider-Man in the series while both of them are fighting Morbius, the living vampire. Morbius is another character that originated in Marvel's horror anthology stories, being a vampire who is still living in a sense, rather than the undead vampires that Blade hunts. In the animated series, Spider-Man was involved in the event that turned the human Dr. Michael Morbius into a vampire, prompting Peter to feel responsibility for him. Morbius stole a vial of Peter's blood, confusing it with a genetically modified test sample, and tries to examine the blood to see how it functioned. However, the blood was drunk by a vampire bat that Morbius kept as a test subject, who also got irradiated by the machine analyzing the blood. When he discovered the bat interfering with his experiment, he tried to shoo it away, only to be bitten by the radiated vampire bat, causing his own body to mutate into a vampiric form. Spider-Man felt empathy for Morbius, who only conducted the experiment to find a cure for his own rare blood disease. However, this causes trouble between him and Blade, who came there to end the life of Morbius before he became a threat to more innocent lives. Blade's hyper-aggression regarding vampires is shown as conflicting with Spider-Man's ability to help Morbius turn back into a human. The aggressive nature of Blade from the comics is adapted directly into the series, to be shown as a foil to Spider-Man's own guilt over creating the monster he is forced to fight. Though Blade's traumatic past and motivations are revealed to Peter by Whistler, Blade is still an antagonistic force in the story, going so far as to hold May Parker hostage to get Peter to get Spider-Man to do as he wants. Blade's mother also has an expanded role in the series, with her being given a name as well as a more detailed characterization in her relationship with Deacon Frost. Miriam also shows up later in the show as a villain, where her fate after giving Blade up for adoption is revealed. While caring for Blade as a single mother, Miriam was attacked and turned by a vampire. Not wanting to raise her son as a vampire and risk drawing him into the world of the undead, Miriam decided to give him up for adoption for his sake. However, this would be one of her last selfless acts, as the transformation into a vampire turned her into a monster, just like every other vampire. In Season 4 of the series, Blade discovers his mother's survival as a vampire and is forced to hunt her down and destroy her, mirroring the comics version of Blade having to kill his own mentor figure after he was turned into a vampire that gave in to the bloodlust. Though the animated series was largely aimed at kids, the storylines with Blade proved that they were not afraid of showcasing some darker storylines than what regular children's animation would portray. As an adaptation, the animated series created a lot of the lore that would go on to redefine the character in the coming decade. Gone are most of the characters supporting cast from the Tomb of Dracula, including Quincy Harker and Rachel Van Helsing, as well as his connections to the Legion of the Damned and Count Dracula himself. With the character being a supporting character in a children's animated TV series, the writers were forced to change some of the more adult elements of the original backstory, as well as the rather dense supporting cast and later stories that came out since the 70s. We also see that the iconic visual design and the style of the character is changed to something more subdued. Instead of his yellow goggles, green jacket, and afro, he is outfitted in a leather jacket with a mullet hairstyle. The animated series reduced it to Blade and Whistler, with the focus being given to Blade's relentless determination in finding and hunting vampires. We will see a lot of the elements from this portrayal of Blade in how the character was eventually redesigned after the release of the 1998 film. A lot of these elements have become crucial to the DNA of the character as we know him today, and it is shocking to see that they originated in the writing room of a children's animated series rather than the dark horror action comic book stories that the character originated from. How did the 1998 film cement the modern origin? Ask anyone about the character of Blade, and 9 times out of 10 they'll mention the live-action 1998 film and its sequels first. In fact, most people probably do not even know of his connections to the Marvel Comics themselves, seeing it as simply an action horror film featuring a vampire hunter named Blade. This speaks to how firmly the films have entrenched themselves in the public consciousness. Stephen Norrington and David S. Goyer, director and writer of the films respectively, managed to overcome the general film-going public's aversion to comic book movies by focusing more on the pulpy horror action elements of the character, and the performance of Wesley Snipes gave the character a deadpan charisma that made him an instant icon in action cinema. The film takes elements from both the comic books and the animated TV series appearances, mixing them both to create a memorable story for the character that remains engraved in public consciousness as the canon origin story. The film begins with an iconic action scene at a blood rave, where an oblivious human is lured into a vampire nightclub where humans are treated as prey. However, this rave is interrupted by the film version of Blade, here decked out in body armor, a long black trench coat, a katana, and a shotgun. This new visual style of Blade reflects the era in which the film was made, with his leather and trench coat look also feeling perfectly at home in the late 90s action aesthetic that would soon explode even further with films like 1999's The Matrix. The style of wire-fu action is also of that era of action filmmaking, backed by star Wesley Snipes' background in martial arts. Wesley Snipes is one of the best castings in comic book cinema, with his martial arts moves complementing his deadpan, cool performance that completely sells the audience on why the vampires of this world are rightfully terrified of him as the Daywalker. The film blends Snipes' stoic yet charismatic performance with Norrington's sleek, horror action direction. This version of Blade was born as Eric Brooks, whose mother, Vanessa Brooks, was attacked by the vampire Deacon Frost. Deacon Frost here is reimagined as a younger, more ambitious vampire who is analogous to young Y2K business types. Blade's mother, Vanessa, is also revealed as a vampire under Frost later in the movie, like how Miriam, Blade's mother in the canon of the animated series, was a villain in Spider-Man, the animated series. However, this attack while killing off his mother turned him into a dhampir, a half-vampire with all the abilities of the vampires and none of the weaknesses, except for a thirst for blood. He suppresses this thirst with the help of a serum created by Whistler, and he dedicates his life to destroying vampires. The origin story is lifted almost directly from the comics, however the comic is no longer British, with him now being an American, and his immunity is traded for his status as a dhampir that originated from Spider-Man the animated series. The character of Whistler is also lifted directly from his animated appearance, with his role as mentor and guy who supplies him with his serum replacing Jabal Afari from the comics. However, Whistler himself is later turned by the villains, forcing Blade to put him down, like how Jamal was turned and killed by Blade in the comics. He also lacks his upbringing in the brothel of Lady Vanity and his community of supporting characters, including characters from Tomb of Dracula and the other women who worked under Lady Vanity. The film would go on to be a massive hit and make Blade a household name. It would also influence how the character would appear in the comics and other adaptations as well. The original design, supporting characters, and even his original appearance were slowly shifted away in favor of what this film brought to the table. Up until that point in time, superhero films were often seen as corny and artificial, with much of the fanbase seen as children and teenagers. Blade became one of Marvel's first major modern theatrical success stories, proving that a darker, R-rated comic book adaptation would work commercially. The sequels would go on to build off of what the first film established, with Whistler revealed to be alive in the second film. Both of the sequels would be scripted by David S. Goyer, though Stephen Norrington left and new directors came aboard for each new film. His popularity would be so huge that more than 20 years after the first film, Wesley Snipes would return as Blade in the film Deadpool and Wolverine, alongside a bunch of other comic book characters as a cameo. Indeed, most of the superhero media and adaptations that came after the original Blade movie bear some mark of influence from this movie, and how it adapted comic book media into the realm of Hollywood. How did the comics retcon Blade to match the movie? The success of the movies, however, introduced a unique problem for a Marvel editorial. If the average movie-going audience, influenced by their positive feelings towards the live-action film, picked up a Marvel comic book featuring the character of Blade, the vampire hunter, what they would find would be completely different compared to what they saw on the big screen. While Wesley Snipes was kicking vampire butt and shooting out quippy one-liners in theaters, during this same time period in the comics, Blade was still largely treated as a human vampire hunter, possessing mainly his immunity to vampire bites rather than the full Daywalker power set. He did not have the superhuman strength or agility that the movie version of Blade had as a result of his status as a Dhampir, nor his status as a Daywalker, someone with vampiric powers who could survive outside in the daylight. The editorial decided to rectify this by changing Blade to reflect this new version of Blade that had become more popular amongst the general public. Blade in 1999 guest starred in a Spider-Man story arc in the pages of Peter Parker's Spider-Man, specifically issues number 7 and 8. The story arc finds Spider-Man coming into conflict with Morbius the living vampire once again, like their encounter in the animated series. Morbius, as seen in the comics, was much more of an anti-hero than he was in the animated series. However, in this story, he is driven to villainy after he is possessed by the villain Hunger. Unable to handle the threat that both these characters pose alone, Spider-Man finds himself turning to Blade for help as they try to keep the citizens of New York safe from the villain. In the struggle, Blade finds himself bitten by Morbius himself. Now, Morbius is a unique character within Marvel's supernatural canon, with him not actually being a vampire proper. Dr. Michael Morbius was a scientist with a rare, life-threatening blood disease who tried to cure it through any means necessary. This led him to create a cure using the DNA of vampire bats and experimental chemicals, which had the unintentional side effects of giving him traits of the vampire bat, as well as mutations that gave him superpowers similar to those of the undead vampires. This transformation also gave him a thirst for blood that makes him go berserk from hunger, making him a complicated character who nevertheless strives to do the right thing. Morbius often finds himself in opposition to Spider-Man, as he finds that Peter Parker's genetically modified DNA holds some cure in dealing with his ravenous hunger. Thus, when Morbius bites Blade, unknown to either of them, the unique nature of Morbius's vampirism interacts with the vampire enzymes within Blade's body, which gives him his immunity to undead vampire influences. Thus, the comic version of Blade finds himself in possession of new, vampiric powers while not having to deal with their weaknesses, which quickly leads to him adopting the moniker of Daywalker. The comic, written by Howard Mackey and drawn by John Romita Jr., is straightforward in its goal, namely to bring the comic version of Blade up to date with what the general public knew of the character of Blade. Gone were the eccentric clothes and the wooden knives, replaced with the guns, katana, and martial arts of the movie version of Blade. Most visual depictions of Blade after 1998 have a distinct similarity to Wesley Snipes' look as the character, which goes to show how that actor and his performance have earned a spot in the mind of the audience as the best incarnation of that character. The bite is the final part of the transformation. No particular emphasis is given to the act of Morbius biting Blade, with the comic simply brushing it off to continue the action of the scene and conclude the story arc. It is only later that the full ramifications of the bite become prevalent to both Blade and the audience at home. Thus, in the pages of Peter Parker's Spider-Man, the comic book version of Blade changed forever into a version much closer to the one that we know and love today. However, this retcon would come to be seen by some fans as a quick fix, with a character who is not central to his original backstory being used as the trigger for such an important transformation. How did a later series finally retool the retcon? Though the character of Blade was now virtually the same across all forms of media, the comic book version suffered from something most comic book characters do: a long and convoluted backstory. From his published comic in 1973, Blade has appeared in a variety of comics and stories, all of which are hard to keep track of. Thus, when he finally received his own comic book run, written by Mark Guggenheim, Marvel tried to streamline more than 3 decades of Blade's history, presenting a new, more cohesive and less convoluted origin story for Blade. Guggenheim's Blade is updated for the modern era, with references to the NSA and the wider Marvel comic book universe to show his complete transition into the modern world of superheroes. Thus, his origins are also updated to fit this modern era Blade. The origins now portray Blade as a Dhampir from birth itself, having been transformed along with his mother when attacked by the vampire Deacon Frost. Much of the backstory is the same as before, with Eric Brooks being brought up in the brothel his mother died in, with his vampiric nature hidden from himself by his adoptive mothers. His hunger was suppressed by serums they would give him under the guise of medicine, though he would soon come to recognize his true nature. Like in the original comics, he would go on to encounter his mentor Jamal Afari, who would go on to teach him the ways of the vampire hunter. Even after the popularity of the character within the movie adaptation, Jamal Afari was not replaced by Abraham Whistler in the comics. The story does not deviate much from the established canon of Blade the character, but seeks to unify it into a coherent whole, as well as try to streamline the messier elements, like Morbius's involvement in him gaining vampiric power. As revealed during a fight with Morbius in this series, Guggenheim's run tries to streamline Blade's origin by emphasizing his vampire physiology from birth, reducing the need to treat Morbius's bite as the sole reason he became the Daywalker. It is somewhat funny the level to which this detail is explicitly denied by the creators of the comic as the whole explanation for his powers, but it serves the purpose of streamlining the decades of published stories into an easy-to-understand backstory for this character. However, Guggenheim did not just change or streamline Blade's backstory, but expanded it with a focus on Blade's biological father, Lucas Cross. Lucas Cross is introduced here as a higher-up in the National Security Agency, or the NSA as it's more commonly known, using his vast resources to decode an ancient prophecy surrounding him, his son Blade, and Dracula. It also drastically involves the wider Marvel universe into this core story, with Lucas Cross revealed to be a Latverian who was imprisoned there by the mother of Dr. Doom herself. Blade's flashbacks reveal past run-ins with characters like Wolverine, as well as his current self having to contend with the Civil War storyline that was ongoing during the time of publication. Guggenheim dragged Blade into the 21st century, with his concerns no longer just being hunting vampires. Now he has to deal with law enforcement, who consider him a serial killer hunting innocent victims. It doesn't help that Blade often steals the belongings of vampires he staked to continue to fund his war against vampires. Guggenheim also widened the kinds of different monsters that Blade hunted, with a possessed mall Santa being a highlight. But this comic in particular established Blade within the Marvel superhero universe, after spending most of his time alone, hunting vampires and showing up as a special appearance in Spider-Man comic books. Blade is now rubbing shoulders with Marvel characters like Maria Hill and Dr. Doom. The story also provided us with the definitive origin story for Blade. No longer is there confusion about his nature as a Dhampir. No longer just a mere human, but a being blessed with vampiric powers since birth, and who has lived his life suppressing and fighting his urge to feed on blood. In one of the more striking scenes in the comic, Blade is offered a cure for his vampirism by none other than Dr. Doom himself. But there was a catch. He would lose his bloodlust for hunting vampires as well. As we see, though he struggled with the decision, he ultimately chose not to take the serum, putting his quest to hunt vampires even above his own well-being. How did the 2006 Spike TV series handle Blade's origin? Back in the world of adaptations, while Guggenheim's run was still ongoing, the Blade live-action films also received an expansion in the form of a TV series for Spike TV, with rapper Sticky Fingers Kirk Jones replacing Wesley Snipes in the title role. The TV series continued the story after the conclusion of Blade Trinity, while also revealing further details of Blade's childhood as the story progressed. The pilot episode for the series was written by David S. Goyer, who wrote the screenplays for all 3 Blade films, as well as popular comic book writer Geoff Johns, who would become famous for being one of the architects of the DC comic universe, specifically the lore surrounding the Green Lantern Corps. Though a worthy continuation of the films, the series was ultimately cancelled after the first season, with Geoff Johns theorizing that, rather than the quality of the TV series, it was the budget to go forward with the vampire action horror series that made Spike TV reconsider renewing it for a second season. The series follows Iraq War veteran Krista Starr, who returns to Detroit after learning of the mysterious death of her twin brother Zach. She dedicates her time to finding the killer of her brother, but she isn't the only one searching. Krista's investigations reveal the fact that Zach was actually working as a familiar. Familiars are humans in the service of vampires, working for them in exchange for the promise of being turned into a vampire themselves and attaining immortality. Krista's investigation led her to Zach's master, Marcus Van Siever, who leads the vampire coven known as the House of Katana. A powerful vampire, Marcus becomes interested in Krista after she confronts him about her brother's death, and he turns her into a vampire. It is then that she first meets Blade, who was also investigating the matter of Zach's death. Blade gives Krista access to the serum that allows him to suppress his vampiric appetite, and asks her for help in avenging Zach's death. Blade reveals that Zach worked for him as a double agent embedded within the House of Katana, a role that he now asks Krista to fulfill. Now, Krista finds herself infiltrating the heart of the vampiric coven and uncovering the secrets and conspiracies of the coven before they can succeed in their goals. The series changes its focus from high-octane action sequences to a more dramatic man-on-the-inside style crime story, with Krista acting as a mole for Blade's operations against vampires. Rather than simply hack and slash and shoot his way through the vampire hordes, Blade is forced to take more advanced measures to deal with Van Siever and his coven's plans. The series continues to use the origin shown in the movies. It uses archival footage from the first movie to flash back to his origins in the pilot episode, but the series also developed Blade's backstory beyond what we've seen in the movies. Most notably, we see Blade as a young Eric Brooks, being raised by his biological father, who had no idea how to raise his half-vampire son. Eric runs away from home after he believed his father betrayed him, but was brought back to his father by a policeman, a friend of his father, who was aware of Eric's condition and was sympathetic to both of them. It was this policeman who introduced Eric to Abraham Whistler, who gave him the serum that helped suppress his vampiric craving for blood, and helped redirect his hate into a dedication to slaying vampires. After the death of Whistler, the role of Blade's weapon handler and tech guy was taken over by a character called Shen, who teamed up with Blade to find and kill the vampire who caused the death of his sister. The series, despite having to recast Wesley Snipes as the title character and work within the limitations of a TV budget, made the story work. Rather than retconning or changing the established lore and backstories, the series instead decided to expand the world depicted by the movies by providing a deeper look not just at the inner workings of a vampire coven, but also at Blade's past and how that shaped him. What did the Marvel anime do differently with Blade's origin? In the late 2000s and early 2010s, Marvel tried to expand into the anime market with the Marvel Anime Project. These anime took classic Marvel superheroes like Iron Man, Wolverine, and Blade and put them into a Japanese setting and stories influenced by anime. The Marvel Anime projects were produced by the famed Japanese animation studio Madhouse, with Warren Ellis involved in developing the overall slate. Marvel Anime Blade focused on the Daywalker's adventures across Asia as he tries to find and kill the vampire responsible for the death of his mother. The anime, like the film, uses the backstory where Blade's mother was attacked at birth by Deacon Frost. However, the anime showcases the darkest and most tragic version of this origin, as his mother returns as a villainous vampire when Blade was only 10 years old. A young Blade is forced to kill his own mother after she kills his foster mothers. The anime adaptation of Blade is unique among the Marvel anime as it freely depicts the violence and horror of its source material, while the other anime are more conservative in how they use violence and gore. This moment in Blade's origin is a key example of this, as it is Blade's first kill, and tragically, he sees his mother return to her former self as she lies dying in his arms. This event can be seen clearly as the start of his obsessive hatred of vampires, which led him to become the vampire slayer he is today. He is assisted in his hunting by his mentor, Noah Van Helsing. Van Helsing helps him in his quest nearly 40 years after he was first depicted helping another Van Helsing descendant in the pages of Tomb of Dracula. The series follows him as he travels across Asia to hunt and dismantle the vampire organization known as Existence, led by Deacon Frost. He is accompanied in his travels by a young rookie vampire hunter, Makoto. The anime uses the setting of Asia to experiment with the type of creatures that Blade faces, which are often based on local folklore of each culture that Blade visits. This gives the anime a unique tone that makes it stand apart from its Western counterparts, which often just feature humanoid vampires as Blade's foes. Each of these creatures is implied to be the result of Frost's experimentation with vampires and humans, which he plans to use to kill the pure-blood vampires. Deacon Frost in this adaptation is revealed to have a sympathetic backstory as well, with his son being killed in the vampire attack that turned him into a vampire. This causes Frost to develop a hatred of the pure-blood vampires who turned him, and he dedicated his life to wiping out the pure-blood vampires and taking their place in the natural order. This goal ironically makes him much more similar to Blade than in any other adaptation, and provides a unique dynamic between the two characters. Both characters are influenced by the death of someone close to them to hunt vampires, though they take different routes to achieve this goal. Frost's megalomaniac nature ultimately leads him to cause more pain and suffering, while Blade works to ensure no one else has to go through what he endured. We've seen Blade evolve from his first appearance in the pages of the Tomb of Dracula to his appearance in the 2024 film Deadpool and Wolverine. The character has undergone numerous changes in the 50 years since he first debuted, but his popularity has never waned. Even now, Marvel's MCU Blade reboot remains in development limbo after multiple delays, creative changes, and removal from Disney's release calendar, but Marvel has still publicly indicated commitment to the character. Meanwhile, an official Marvel's Blade video game from Bethesda and Arcane Lion is in development. It seems that even to this day, the demand for Blade has not lessened.